Welcome to this session of Family Communication. In this session, we talk about one of the most challenging and dynamic of all family relationships, the relationship between siblings. The communication between siblings is fraught with difficulty. In the younger years, there's a lot of conflict. There's often a lot of rivalry. It includes jealousy. It includes often a fair bit of nastiness. But at the same time, it can be one of the most worthwhile and emotion-packed of all the relationships that occur in a family setting. And so in this session, we'll explore the research with respect to how siblings communicate with one another. We'll look a little bit at the research on conflict, a bit about sibling rivalry, talk about tattling, and also talk a little bit about the advice that siblings seem to love to give. Well, in the research, there's a sense in which sibling communication is unique. There are a number of dynamics that animate the sibling relationship that make communication between brothers and sisters, or sisters and sisters, or brothers and brothers a rather challenging kind of thing. One of those dynamics is what's known as hierarchy. Inevitably, there's some sort of hierarchy to all sibling relationships. Someone is born first, or someone comes to the family before someone else does. And because of this, built into all sibling relationships is a sense of where you stand in relation to your siblings. And the research finds that that dynamic animates a lot of the communication that occurs between siblings. Furthermore, that dynamic of hierarchy starts at a very early age and continues on throughout the lifespan. So one of the things we know is that where there is hierarchy, there will be concerns of power. And typically, individuals that are higher on the hierarchy have more power than those that are lower on the hierarchy. And so, when it comes to sibling relationships, a great deal of the interactions that occur communicatively can be viewed through the lens of power and how that power stems from being somewhere on the hierarchy. So, for example, you may have heard it said that oftentimes one of the siblings think that the other one gets away with murder. Sometimes it's the older sibling who thinks that parents are parenting younger siblings differently, and so the younger sibling gets away with murder. Well, in that kind of an instance, there may well be conflict between the older and younger sibling, which stems not just from the particular topic of the conflict that day. Let's say it's about the curfew times that the younger child has, which are different than that of the older. But instead, that conflict can be profitably viewed through the lens of power and hierarchy. And the fact of the matter is, this differential treatment is seen to be unfair because of the power differential in the hierarchy. Regardless, notions of hierarchy have been found to animate a number of different areas of communication between siblings. So, for example, younger siblings typically lack the power that older siblings do. And so that often causes younger siblings to create conflict with their older siblings. We know that oftentimes that can manifest itself by throwing tantrums or by tattling or by simply lashing out at the older sibling. And so communicatively, those kinds of things can be explained not just because of whatever occurred in the moment, but it can be seen as an attempt to express power or to reclaim what is perceived to be a depravity of power. In this case, it's the younger sibling who has less power than the older, and so the younger sibling is tattling, or the younger sibling is lashing out, or the younger sibling invokes a kind of conflict. Now, hierarchy can work itself out in many different ways in a sibling relationship, and we'll apply the notion of hierarchy to a couple of those in a few moments. But let's talk about a second dynamic which is related to hierarchy, but is a bit more specific, and that's the dynamic of birth order. Now, psychologists will tell you that there is a large area of research pertaining to birth order, and it's far beyond the scope of this class to talk about that research. However, we can pick from that research certain aspects that speak into the communicative dimensions of birth order. Or to put it differently, we can look at that research and say that birth order does in some ways influence specific ways that siblings communicate with one another. So, for example, one of the things we know is that firstborn children tend more often to try and take charge of things than do children that are middle or lastborn children. And so this idea of taking charge of things often comes with a kind of direct communication, ordering, for example, being bossy, as you might have heard it said when you were younger. And so this rudeness or this pushing to get your way communicatively is more often found in older siblings than in younger siblings. And one reason for this is because the birth order seems to give the firstborn child the perceived right to do the ordering, to be the one bossing people around. Now, of course, in some instances, it makes sense for this to happen because there's a significant age difference between the firstborn child and the children that come after. That age difference oftentimes just gives them greater responsibility, in part perhaps because the parents have placed that responsibility on them. Yet research finds that even when that responsibility is not perceived, or when the parents don't put it on the child directly, firstborn children still, comparatively, tend to do more ordering around, more direct expression of desires than do children that are born in the middle or that are born last. We also know, for example, that middle children, as a cohort, tend to be more negotiators. They tend to be individuals that play the role of peacekeeper on a more regular basis. And so because of this, they have a tendency to compromise or to submit to the will of older or younger siblings. And so communicatively, what that means is that oftentimes these individuals are acting in such ways as to diffuse conflict or to avoid conflict. It also means that they're able, more so than younger or firstborn children, to be able to ignore what might be a kind of difficult conflict situation. And so there's much more that could be said about birth order. We could, for example, say that the youngest children, the last born, tend to be the ones that are pleasers. They tend to be the ones that find themselves in situations where they more often are using humor as a means of communication. While all of those things are true, the fact of the matter is that all of the research on birth order is really rather tricky. Because while there is good substantive research linking birth order to different kinds of outcomes, it is just one of many factors that determine not just communication, but a number of other things in family life. And honestly, you have to take the birth order research with a grain of salt. As with any kind of research, there still remains that tension between universality and idiosyncrasy. And a lot of the more recent research suggests that birth order may not play quite the large role that we once thought that it did. Nevertheless, you cannot discount birth order. Instead, you take it into account as a dynamic, along with hierarchy and several others that animate the communication that occurs between siblings. A third dynamic that is part of all communication between siblings is what's known as backstory and history. You might recall that in a previous session, we talked about this distinction between a remote cause of conflict and a proximate cause of conflict. In that session, we said that a proximate cause of conflict is seeing whatever happened immediately before the conflict as being the cause of that conflict. So, for example, if two siblings find themselves in conflict over whose turn it was to take the dishes from the table to the dishwasher, you might find that conflict and say, well, it started because of the bickering over whose turn it was to remove the dishes and take them to the dishwasher. That would be a proximate cause. But the remote cause would be some underlying dynamic, some previous set of occurrences, or a pattern of behavior of which this is just the most recent illustration. So in this case, the remote cause of the conflict between the siblings is not so much that, let's say, Danny didn't want to take the dishes from the table to the dishwasher, but instead it's because Danny's brother Billy sees Danny's unwillingness as part of a larger pattern of his sibling trying to get out of doing his share of the chores. That would be a remote cause. Well, all of this relates to backstory and history, because perhaps more than any other family relationship, the sibling relationship is heavily influenced by backstory and history. Because siblings have grown up with each other, they have a large bank of experiences and a large repository of memories upon which to draw. And all of those things are often brought to bear in a particular episode. So, for Danny and Billy, although they are arguing about whether or not it's the turn of a particular sibling to take dishes to the dishwasher, this incident is seen in the larger context of other evening meals, or other chores that were done or avoided, or other interactions between Billy and Danny. And so backstory and history wants us to ask the question of how interactions between siblings are driven not so much by whatever happens in the moment or in that episode, but instead in the larger context of the relationship between those people. And while that is also true for spouses, for example, or between adult children and their parents, the reality is that it is more often on display among siblings than any other relationship in the family. And so what we know is that siblings are far more likely to have on their mind this kind of backstory. They're far more aware of the history between the siblings than you might imagine. And so they tend, more often than other kinds of relationships, to view interactions through the lens of backstory. If you think about your own interactions with your siblings, you can probably think of some patterns of behavior or some attitudes between you and your sibling that you think have animated your interactions with them. You might think, for example, that your brother is just a slacker, or that your sister was always mom's favorite. And so these kinds of histories will certainly influence the way you communicate with that sibling. So being aware of history and backstory becomes really important. And I would also add that for parents, it becomes especially important to understand how history and backstory might be informing whatever interactions there are between siblings. You see, parents oftentimes don't take history and backstory into account. And it's understandable why that would be the case. Parents often are simply not aware of the backstory or the history. They can't get inside their children's heads to know how they view that backstory and history. And so, not having access to those kinds of bits of information, parents get stuck only seeing what we call the proximate cause, not the remote cause, or in this case, not the history or the backstory. In fact, I'll bet that if I asked you to write down your views of the history or the backstory to a particular part of your relationship with your sibling, let's say chores, for example, it might be very different than what would happen if I asked your parents to do the same thing. Regardless, history and backstory becomes a very powerful dynamic that animates much of sibling communication. Another dynamic that also animates sibling communication is sibling closeness. All siblings have this perceived closeness to one another. In fact, it's common for any relationship. You have a perceived closeness to your parents, or to your roommate, or to the people you work with. And so it's also similar with respect to siblings. But again, because of the long history between siblings, because of the residential component of siblings, because of birth order and hierarchy and everything else, sibling closeness is a complicated kind of a thing. Well, we know that there are some differences with respect to how siblings perceive the closeness to one another. So, for example, in the research, we find that females typically tend to experience greater closeness, greater admiration, and greater affection for their siblings than do males. Or to put it differently, sisters are likely to feel close to one another, or a sister and brother might feel close to one another. Comparatively speaking, brothers might not feel as close to one another, or the brother in the brother-sister dyad might not feel as close to his sister as his sister does feel to him. And these research findings are highly consistent with much research we've found in other areas that simply say that females tend to value relationships. They place a greater emphasis on connection than do males. And it's interesting that this is true among siblings because it begins at a rather young age. So, in other words, we see that siblings naturally, as females being closer to one another, this carries over into other relationships as they go through the life cycle. We know that comparatively speaking, sister-sister pairs are the closest of all sibling relationships. In fact, if we're putting them into an order, sister-sister relationships are at the top. They tend to be closer than other permutations. So, for example, they tend to be closer than sister-brother relationships, which in turn tend to be closer than brother-brother relationships. Now, those are all comparative statements. Don't think that I've just said that two brothers or three brothers cannot be close. Obviously, they can, and often are. But generally speaking, all things being equal, the sister-sister pairing will feel closer and exhibit more indicators of closeness than any other pairing. Now, like everything else in family communication, we have to take into consideration idiosyncrasies, unique family circumstances, the personalities of the people involved, whatever experiences have occurred throughout the sibling relationship. But that doesn't take away from the basic idea that there are these differences between brothers and brothers or sisters and sisters and things like that. One of the things that is interesting is that with respect to the entire lifespan, we find that as you age, brother-brother dyads tend to drop off in their closeness as you get into the emerging adult and full adult years. On the other hand, sister-sister dyads tend to grow closer as you get into the emerging adult and the full adult years. So it seems as if for the sister-sister combination, whatever closeness is present is strengthened, whereas for the brother-brother dyad, whatever closeness occurs when you're younger doesn't grow and develop. Instead, it tends to wither and go away. And those findings are consistent with other research that simply finds that males are not as interested in maintaining and creating connection, and also research that finds that males typically don't feel the need for multiple connections. In fact, there's much research that finds that for females, what ends up happening is a kind of additive effect. So if you have, for example, a female who is in college and she has her college friends and she has a relationship with her parents and she has her sibling, her sister, for example, and then let's say she falls in love and is engaged and has someone who will soon be her spouse. So she essentially is adding all of these. Now, one or more may be closer, so she may be closer to the man she's going to marry than she is to her sister or her mom, but she's adding these together. For males, on the other hand, it's not so much additive as much as it is replacing. So, for example, in his high school years, a male may feel close to his brother and his group of friends. But as the male gets into college, he goes to a different college than his brother, and so he, in a sense, replaces his relationship with his brother with his college friends. And then let's say he marries someone soon after college, and so his spouse then becomes the chief relationship in his life, and so his friends diminish. And so the research in a larger context about males and females and how they see and manage relationships gets translated into the sibling relationship. I think that's important because sometimes sisters expect their brothers to have a similar kind of closeness of relationship that they simply don't have. And so therefore, this becomes a dynamic that may animate some of that communication. Well, now let's look a little bit at another dynamic that also animates much of sibling communication. It's differential treatment. If you think about it, it's fairly common for parents to try and treat their kids equally, to try and treat their kids the exact same way. In fact, research finds that for many individuals, this is aspirational. We believe that's how it's supposed to be, that parents should interact with and treat their kids as fairly or as uniformly as possible. The reality, of course, is it doesn't work that way. Moreover, the reality is that siblings are highly sensitive to this notion of differential treatment. One of the things we find, for example, is that about 1/3 of the time, siblings will perceive whatever their parents have done to be an example of differential treatment. So, for example, anytime a parent says something to the child, about 1 of every 3 instances, a child is going to perceive there to be differential treatment. Now, the key is that there's a perception here. The reality may be quite different, but frankly, the reality is irrelevant. All that matters is the perception of differential treatment. And so, for example, if a child happens to be at the store with her mother and the mother buys the child something, when the child gets home, the sibling sees that his sister, for example, has just purchased something new. Mom has purchased it for her. And so he gets a little bit miffed by that. There's an immediate perception of differential treatment. Now, the mom didn't intend that, and the mom might say, well, honey, don't you realize that I paid for you to go to the movies just a couple of weeks ago? In the mom's mind, that's not differential treatment because she did something nice and expended some money for both siblings. However, in the brother's mind, that is differential treatment because they're separate categories. One is movie going, one is clothing. And so what we see then is that the perception of differential treatment is really all that matters. Now, this perception of differential treatment is interesting because we find much greater sensitivity on the part of siblings to preferential treatment than parents can ever imagine. In fact, siblings are very good at keeping score. That is to say, being aware of differential treatment and attaching a value to that differential treatment. This becomes a form of intrapersonal communication where in your mind, you're aware of it. In your mind, you're pondering it. And moreover, in your mind, you're linking that preferential treatment to subsequent kinds of interactions. Now, earlier in this session, we mentioned the idea of backstory and history. As you might imagine, perceptions of differential treatment are a significant part of the backstory or the history that siblings perceive. And so communicatively, many of the interactions between siblings can be seen as an outgrowth of their perception of differential treatment. So for example, there's research that finds a greater level of antagonism or resentment or distress that occurs when siblings perceive there to be significant amounts of differential treatment. I mean, after all, you're familiar with the story of Cinderella, right? And how Cinderella perceived differential treatment between her stepmother and her step-siblings. And so that simple story gives you a glimpse into how it is this differential treatment occurs. We also know, again, back to Cinderella, that those that receive differential treatment oftentimes perceive it favorably and then, in a sense, throw that into the face of or use that to support their power over the siblings that don't have the preferential or the differential treatment. And so we find that oftentimes conflicts occur because you have this expression of power which stems from the perception of differential treatment. Now, what's interesting is how siblings respond to differential treatment. Typically speaking, the younger you are, the more you respond poorly to this differential treatment. The older you get, the more mature you get, you tend to respond better to the differential treatment. But hey, even having said that, we know that oftentimes there is this kind of pushing back against differential treatment by acting passive-aggressively toward your sibling. Or to put it differently, if you perceive that you are receiving less treatment than your sibling, rather than trying to push back against parents for that, you're more likely to try and push back against siblings. This becomes part of the story in Genesis of Joseph and his interactions with his brothers. After Joseph's father gives him the coat of many colors, his brothers, perhaps rightly, perceive that to be differential treatment, preferential treatment given to Joseph as opposed to them. And so when Joseph shows up with his coat of many colors, his brothers decide they're going to get back at him. And so, as you well know in the story, they decide to sell him into slavery. Anyway, the point is, differential treatment becomes a significant dynamic that animates the sibling relationship. Now, let's talk specifically about some of the communicative actions that occur between siblings as the sibling relationships unfold. One specific communicative action is what's called advice giving. Advice giving is this idea that one person will offer unsolicited advice to other people. So it might be, for example, that your sister decides she's going to tell you who it is you should date, or your brother is going to tell you that you should try out for football. And so the idea is that someone is adopting a position of power, or at least a position of greater knowledge, because they know better than you. The older sibling, the older brother, tells the younger brother, based on his wisdom, that he should try out for football. And so the idea is that advice giving oftentimes is a manifestation of power. Now, we know that older siblings tend to see the giving of advice as their prerogative. They tend to see that not necessarily as a birthright, but they see that as a natural outgrowth of being older. In fact, research suggests that by the time you get to the teenage and emerging adult years, there's very much this idea that the bank of experiences that older siblings have becomes the basis for which they can give the advice that is unsolicited to younger siblings. Now, it may well be that older siblings are framing this as them doing their younger siblings a favor. After all, the older brother, who is in high school and knows how it works, is giving advice to the younger sibling and saying, you should try out for football, you'll be in a good group, you'll have some popularity, you'll attain some status, etc., etc., etc. And so advice giving more often tends to come from older to younger, or alternatively, from more powerful to less powerful. By the way, one permutation of this is when blended families are examined with respect to this notion of advice giving. Oftentimes you see advice giving that occurs when a blended family comes together and you have, for example, the biological daughter giving advice to the non-biological sibling about how to handle a relationship with what is now that non-biological sibling's stepmom. And so, although there are some complexities that go with blended families that we'll talk about in a subsequent session, the point is simply that you oftentimes have someone who perceives them to have wiser or better experiences, and that prompts them to give advice to the siblings below them. Now, a more narrow example of this kind of advice giving is the so-called mini-mom. It's where one of the siblings, typically an older sister, begins to interact with younger siblings in a manner similar to that of the mother. Now, these mini-moms oftentimes are bossing younger siblings around. They're oftentimes casting judgment. They're oftentimes taking the role of exerting the power in the kinds of areas where the mother may in fact have done that. And so oftentimes this is done to try and control the younger siblings and to, in essence, allow the older sister to exert some power over the younger siblings. Now, what's interesting about this is the similarities between what the sister is doing and what the mother has done. Research finds there's a very similar aspect to how these mini-moms are interacting with their younger siblings. In fact, there appears to be a clear modeling effect where the older sister will interact with the younger siblings communicatively in a way very similar to how the mom interacts with both the older sister and her siblings. And so whatever the mom has done seems to be modeled in the life of the older sibling. And in the research, we find that older sisters tend to do this throughout the life cycle. In fact, there's really interesting research that finds that even among sisters that are in their 60s and 70s, you still have older sisters unsolicited offering advice, unsolicited acting as a kind of mini-mom. Another specific kind of communication that occurs among siblings is conflict. Now, earlier in this session, we talked a bit about family conflict, but the focus there was more on spousal conflict or on conflict between parents and children. As you well know, if you have siblings, conflict is a large part of sibling relationships. And so there is some research which we can speak to that looks specifically at how conflict works with siblings. And as you might imagine, there are some strong similarities between how conflict works with other family members and how it works among siblings. But at the same time, there are also some things that are rather unique about sibling conflict. Let's start with this. Siblings tend to have more conflict on a more regular basis than practically any other family dyad. This is particularly true when siblings are younger. In fact, ironically, if you look at a life cycle of conflict among siblings, the older you get, typically the less conflict there is. Now, that's not to say that teenagers that are siblings don't ever have conflict. It's simply to say that the frequency of conflict tends to be smaller by the time you get to your late teenage years than it was, say, when you were both in 4th and 6th grade. And part of that is because when you're younger, you lack the tools to avoid conflict. You tend to have less self-control. You get drawn into conflict more frequently because you're just reacting. You know, 4th graders, they oftentimes don't have that ability to walk away from a conflict. They don't have that ability to rein in those immediate reactions that lead to an escalation of conflict. Now, teenagers might not be a great deal better at that, but they are probably comparatively better at that. And so the frequency of conflict among siblings is significantly higher when you're younger than when you're a little older. But even then, if you take a look at siblings at any point, at least until you leave the house, they tend to have more conflict than, say, parents and kids, or even than most spouses. And so conflict becomes a kind of communication that is quite common and therefore animates a lot of sibling interactions. One interesting thing about conflict as it pertains to sibling is research that finds that conflict among siblings is what's called a significant socialization arena. Or to put it differently, you learn a lot about how to handle conflict because you have a lot of conflict with your siblings. In fact, there's research that finds that some of the things that people do in conflict when they're, say, an emerging adult are the same kinds of things that they first learned when they were in conflict with their siblings. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Because as you grow up, the person with whom you'll have the most conflict is likely to be giving you opportunities to practice or to develop whatever habits you have in conflict. And so if you lash out against your sibling and continue to do that all the time you grow up, it should be no surprise that that becomes part of your habit, part of how you naturally do conflict. And so for many people, kids learn how to do conflict at a young age, and that carries over. Now, there's obviously change in that because hopefully as you mature, you do develop more self-control and you are able to avoid conflict, or you are able to develop better conflict management skills. But from a very young age, essentially you learn to do conflict by having conflict with your sibling. One of the things about sibling conflict is that compared to other kinds of conflict, it tends to be highly ephemeral. It's highly episodic. What we mean by ephemeral is it's there for a moment and then it's gone. It flares up and then it goes away. There tends to be, for example, far more conflicts among siblings that just appears and then disappears. So for instance, imagine a couple of siblings that are arguing just in a brief moment about who gets to ride a bike. There's one bike, the kids have to share it, and so let's say that Tommy wants to ride the bike. All of a sudden, Johnny decides he wants to ride the bike. There's a brief tussle over the bike, and pretty soon, Johnny runs off and tells his mom. His mom comes in and tries to settle the dispute, and 10 minutes later, Tommy and Johnny are okay because they're sitting down having cookies together in the kitchen. Now, it doesn't mean that everything's great, but it means that that quick blow-up of an episode quickly dissipates. Compare that, for example, with spousal communication, which tends to be less ephemeral. There tends to be more lingering kinds of emotional reactions with spousal conflict or with parents and kids than there is between siblings. Now, that's less true when you get to the teenage years, but it's still, comparatively speaking, is true compared to other kinds of conflict scenarios. We also know, for example, that parents will want to intervene to try and solve the conflicts between siblings. You can think of many times in your life where, as in the example I just gave, your parent intervened to try and sort out the conflict between you and your siblings. So, as Johnny and Tommy are arguing about the bike, the mom comes out to the driveway and puts her hands on her hips and tells Johnny and Tommy exactly how things are going to be. It's quite common for parents to do this. Obviously, parents would like there to be peace in the house, and so whenever they can sort out a conflict, parents believe that's to the good. And clearly, this conflict intervention not only brings peace to the family, but it also is an opportunity for a parent to repair the disruption in a relationship between the siblings. And parents have a vested interest in trying to make sure that relationships between family members are not disrupted. What's interesting, however, is the research that finds that parental intervention actually tends to make the ultimate end result of the conflict worse. Here's how. Mom comes, puts her hands on her hips, and tells Johnny how this is going to be. Tommy's going to ride the bike, he's going to take a turn for a half hour, and then Johnny's going to have a turn for a half hour. Mom walks away, conflict seems to have ended. Well, the problem is, because of the backstory and history that I talked about earlier, Johnny and Tommy don't just see this particular episode, they see this episode in the larger context of previous interactions between Johnny and Tommy and Mom. And they may also factor into that perceived differential treatment we talked about a moment ago. And so parental intervention oftentimes ends up promoting unintentionally these kinds of negative attitudes that feed whatever perceptions people have of differential treatment or of perceived history and backstory. And so actually the research finds that a better strategy would be for mom to come out of the house, put her hands on the hips, and tell her kids they have to work it out themselves. In fact, there's research that finds that that kind of socialization for handling conflict actually yields far better results than parental intervention all the time. Why is that? It's because parents that do that are teaching their kids conflict resolution skills. And there's research that finds that the earlier those kids learn those conflict resolution skills, the ability to work things out for themselves, the more positive benefits there are as they move on later in life. And so all of these kinds of things become very specific communicative types of behaviors. Let me give you one more specific behavior, and then we'll talk about what happens when siblings move on in the life cycle. The last specific kind of communication is very, very germane to sibling relationships. It's tattling and the secrets that oftentimes come along with being a sibling in a family member. Tattling, as I use the term here, is telling on your sibling. It's sharing some piece of information with your parents that your sibling would not want shared, but it's often done in such a way as to put the sharer of the information into a more favorable, more powerful position than the one about whom the information pertains. So in this case, tattling becomes a really common thing that occurs among siblings because it is, in essence, a kind of button that can be pushed to accrue some power. So if you have a brother and a sister who are both in high school and they don't have the greatest relationship, and the brother is sneaking into the house one night about a half hour after he was supposed to be home, his sister is aware of this, and so the next day at dinner, the sister lets it be known to mom and dad that her brother was sneaking in a half hour after curfew. She's just tattled on him. Now, she does that in part because she wants to get the brother in trouble, because in doing so, she looks good. She has a higher spot on the hierarchy than the brother. At the same time, the sister, by sharing that information, creates alignment with her parents. Remember, alignment is that idea we talked about many sessions ago that puts family members in direct connection. It puts them on the same side, so to speak. So by sharing that information, by tattling, in essence, the sister is putting herself on the same side as the parents. That is to say, on the side that says, we don't want anyone in the family staying out after curfew and then sneaking in. So tattling can be viewed through the lens of power and can be seen as a common way that siblings try and exert power over one another. But let's say that the sister decides she's not going to tattle on the brother. Instead, let's say she's going to keep that to herself. She now knows a secret. And so families oftentimes have a lot of secrets. In fact, it's almost inevitable. Given the number of years that people are interacting with one another, given the kinds of things that occur in a family relationship, it's not surprising that research finds that virtually every family has some kind of secret or multiple secrets. And so, what do you do with that? Well, what's interesting is that we talked about alignment a moment ago and how, in the example I gave, the sister aligns herself with her parents. We find in the research that siblings often align themselves with one another when they know secrets about other members of the family. And so during the at-home years, in other words, before kids move out to go to college, for example, that sharing of secrets with one another becomes a common bond between siblings. In a sense, it aligns them against their parents. And so if the sister knows the brother has been sneaking out and chooses not to tell the parents, then she and her brother can align themselves together against their parent. And it's quite common for siblings to use secrets as a way of creating this bond, of creating this sense of alignment. Now, of course, because the sister knows the secret and the brother doesn't want the sister to share that, the sister, even though she's keeping the secret, still has more power. Because at any point in time, she can share that secret with her parents. It then becomes no longer a secret, and now she aligns herself with someone else. So it's a dangerous game, in a sense, that brother and sister are playing, but it's quite common for secrets as a communicative artifact to be used for both alignment and a potential expression of power. Well, so much of what we've talked about pertains to siblings when you're younger. And though I've drawn some distinctions about what happens when you leave the house, the reality is most of the research on siblings has been done among those kids that are still at home, especially during the teenage years. But there is more recent research that looks at the relationship between siblings during the emerging adult years. So what does it look like to be a sibling as an emerging adult? I would imagine most of you that are in this course are in the emerging adult years. You're somewhere between your 18th birthday and your 30th birthday. And so as an emerging adult, what's your relationship like with your siblings? Well, about 2/3 of emerging adults will say that their sibling is one of their close friends. And in fact, the relationship between emerging adult siblings exhibits a lot of the same kinds of communication that occurs among friendships. Or to put it differently, the sibling relationship takes on more of the feel and the communicative tone of a friendship than it does a sibling relationship. So that means, for example, there's less conflict. It means, for example, there's a more sharing of your life, this self-disclosure. It means, for example, that there tends to be more social support that's provided. And so in the emerging adult years, there's oftentimes a greater sense of perceived closeness. Now, as I said earlier, that's particularly true for sisters, and it's less true for brothers. But generally speaking, there is this sense that the relationship between siblings becomes very similar to that of friendship. Now, the notions of hierarchy or of whatever sibling rivalry there was, they're still there. In fact, research finds that if there's significant sibling rivalry during the growing up years, it still maintains, though at a lower level, in the emerging adult years. But one reason why it begins to diminish a little bit is because in the emerging adult years, you have a greater opportunity to chart your own course, so to speak. And so in charting your own course, you're able to separate yourself from your sibling, which oftentimes eliminates the kinds of conflict areas you might have had prior to that separation and creation of a truly separate identity. So one of the things we know is that in the emerging adult years, because you do mature, or at least we hope, and because you do have a broader range of experiences, and because you tend to have more relationships in your life, siblings tend to be more direct in their expression of affection. You're more likely to articulate your appreciation, your love, and your value for your siblings when you're emerging adults than when you're much younger. Now, that's consistent with other research just generally about how people express affection or express support, but I think it's important to note, because if you're one of those individuals that's rather early in your emerging adult years, your relationship with your sibling may still be much like it was when you were a teenager. But as you move through the emerging adult years, you can expect the kinds of changes that I've talked about just a moment ago. Finally, one of the last things that I need to note is that there still remains in the emerging adult years the presence of a so-called adult role. So earlier we talked about this idea of a mini-mom, or we talked about the idea of giving advice. And research suggests that oftentimes this continues even into the emerging adult years. In fact, many emerging adult siblings are still aggravated that their older sibling wants to give them advice or wants to pass judgment on the choices they make. It never really seems to go away. This notion of birth order, this notion of advice giving, this notion of a sense of prerogative for older siblings to tell younger siblings how it is. And so, those are just some of the changes that might occur during the emerging adult years. Overall, the relationship between siblings is a difficult one. It is a complex one. Like everything else we've talked about in this course, it's fraught with idiosyncrasy, and there are a number of factors that contribute to it. But because they're typically a part of most people's experiences in family life, it's important to understand these dynamics and to see how everything fits together.